Welcome to Awakened Exchanges. I'm your host, Jay Rich, and this is the first episode of what I hope will be a long run. However, before we get to the first guest, in the next episode, I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of who I am and why you should care about this podcast at all. Hopefully, this is going to give you a reason to come back and engage in the exchange. With that in mind, here's a little bit of who we are and what we're trying to do here at Awakened Exchanges. First off, hopefully my voice isn't sounding as strained as it feels, but we're sitting through what are likely to be the worst and most deadly fires in Oregon history. The smoke has been thick for days, and it doesn't help that my day job is driving around to places in various levels of evacuation order. That said, I hope you don't take the awakened in our name too seriously. I am by no means claiming to be woke. I am just trying to facilitate open and honest exchanges with our fellow human beings. I do like to think that I'm alert to a lot of the injustices in our society, but also that some people blow things out of proportion. I also disagree with how some people respond to those injustices, even though I do think there needs to be a response. With that in mind, why can't we at least discuss those situations and what we can do about them? Now, the first concept for this script actually started just before COVID changed the world, and then all of a sudden George Floyd's murder set it on fire. We're now sitting through more than 100 days of protests here in Portland. As I record this, it seems like the response has definitely begun. That said, we at Awakened Exchanges are not social justice warriors. We're just here trying to communicate with other people. We want to start conversations and get the word out on subjects that need more awareness. Hopefully we can help awaken some of us from this complacent lifestyle we've been living in. After all, open is human nature. Just look at how children actually try and share before they could even speak. It's only as we grow up that we get hurt and learn to close ourselves off. We try and protect ourselves from that inevitable pain that comes with this life. I might take some flack for this, but while I truly do believe that Black Lives Matter, I also believe that all lives matter. Sadly, some in the Republican Party have people using that phrase when what they're really trying to say is white lives matter. That message should have been retired long before MLK was martyred for his beliefs. We need to remember that MLK was starting to speak up not just about the black lives in our communities, but about the poor lives in our country as well. And that's a message we can't let slide this time around. Until those same Republicans pony up and give us a real universal healthcare system, until they provide us a universal basic income so we can stabilize the rampant poverty in our society, until they can prove that they actually care about every race, sex, gender, and in between, then no one should be saying the phrase, all lives matter. I wish we had a better name for this movement, and I think that it needs to define itself better so it can keep growing. But until then, please remember that Black Lives Matter and all lives matter. So let's get it right for once. Let's not throw in the towel just yet. We all deserve equal rights. I don't know what the solution is, but let's figure it out by coming together and not by starting another civil war. That was a lot so I just can't let it go any further without emphasizing that we're actually here to have a little bit of fun too. I tend to get a bit serious, but I also mean it in good humor. I was inspired to be creative long ago by one of the original Podfathers himself, Kevin Smith. You can probably see some memorabilia back here. This is just kind of some of my inspiration stuff. Forgive it, but it is what it is. I actually saw Mallrats before I saw Clerks, but I was 14, so what do you expect? I quickly followed it up with Clerks and then Chasing Amy, but who am I kidding? I was a fan as soon as I saw Stan the Man Lee showing up halfway through Mallrats. Back then, I was just a smart kid that got lucky to work with a few industry professionals. Special shout out to Ray Crissing for getting me into inking, and David Brewer for fostering that creative spark and giving me the confidence to learn some penciling myself. I was a voracious reader and dreamer that wanted to tell meaningful stories to people for most of my life. I didn't do much with my bachelor's degree despite its emphasis in screenwriting, but it did add a facet to my skill set that has served me well over the years. We will most definitely talk movies, music, UFOs, pop culture, but no topic is off limits here. Why not try to start conversations on topics that we're all interested in, but no one is really addressing? Let's take universal basic income, for example. Why don't those multi-billion-dollar tech companies that are all making their money off of us actually pay for the right to use our data? That's where their money's coming from. For $2,500 a month, most people can squeeze out a fair amount of life in this country. Let's see, that's $30,000 a year per person. That will allow everyone the freedom to stop stressing. Okay, they'll be able to freely spend in the economy and participate in this wonderful country that is America. Don't kid yourself, all right? Nobody should be a slave to a paycheck. The entire economy is going to be upside down after COVID, and we're going to have to find another way. Maybe this could be the start. Who knows? From there, we could end up talking about multiverse theory or holographic universe hypotheses. Or how about the possibility that we're all living in a collapsing field of potential realities and there could be who knows how many alternate realities out there. What if all these timelines are coexisting within the same space-time? Or what if we're actually living in a simulation? What if it's only the shared moments that need to be accounted for by the system as a whole, and therefore everyone's perception is an actual reality? Maybe even multiple realities. Maybe those individual realities can only get reconciled into one when each individual embraces themselves and learns to get past their own fears and doubts. Or maybe that's a bit heavy for the first few minutes of a new podcast, right? But we all know there are plenty of heavy things in this world. And when times are tough, that's when we need to remember the good times the most. We need those good, lighthearted, loving kinds of things in our lives so that we can remember why we're here in the first place. This is a world of connections, and we can't let those connections atrophy, or else we're going to breed fear and hate. I hope that some of the conversations we have on here help to bridge some perspectives and make even the heavy things a little bit lighter. And like Neale Donald Walsch wished to do with his books, maybe this podcast can help in some small, incremental way to move humanity away from the intolerance, selfishness, anger, and violence that seem to permeate so much of everyday life. As for the future guests themselves, it's probably going to start with a fairly eclectic group of individuals, a fair number of which are going to probably come from my cannabis industry connections, such as our first guest in the next episode. More on him later. But I'm hoping to interview a wide range of people. I want to include many topics, including multi-generational talk to first-hand accounts from protesters and reporters and city leaders, to occult, esoteric, philosophical, psychedelic, metaphysical discussions, anything in between. At some point, maybe I'll even be lucky enough to interview some of the podcasters that have influenced me over the years. I hope that you will see a common thread flowing through all of my exchanges here. One that humanity should rise up and make this planet what we need, not let it become a collapsing capitalist nightmare. Okay, from the sounds of things so far, you've likely figured out not only if you're going to be interested in what we do here, but also that you're probably going to hear the occasional rant as well. Much like, arguably, the original podfather himself, Adam Curry, we have no agenda here on Awakened Exchanges. I hope my rants will be mostly well-founded, but I will try to respond to respectful discourse otherwise. If you can't be respectful, please don't expect a response from me. As for me, I have worked in the cannabis industry for the last few years, and that allowed me a fair amount of time to listen to podcasts while I was working. Before that, I was a voracious reader, sometimes reading 3 to 5 books a week for a long stretch, but there's more on that at a later date. Or you can go over to the Patreon page. It'll probably be up at the same time this is live. I've got a wide variety of knowledge and interest, and I'm going to take a lot of advice from some of the best podcasters in the world. I've got a wide variety of knowledge and interest, and I'm going to take a lot of advice from some of the best podcasters in the industry, such as the great Joe Rogan, the wonderful Eric Weinstein, the amazing Lex Friedman, try spelling it without an E, and the passionate Dr. Jordan Peterson, among many others, of course. But you're forewarned that I'm not going to pander to my audience. I'm going to assume that if you're listening to me, you can follow a conversation, you're going to be willing to look up a few things if you're interested or don't understand. Speaking of the wonderful Weinstein, I'm going to start like he did and plug some services that I use myself. Who knows, maybe some sponsorships will actually follow and I can do this full time someday. DuckDuckGo, anybody? I'm going to do my best to make sure none of the ads get intrusive, and I will also guarantee that I won't talk about anything that I don't use myself. The only quality here because quality begets quality. Right, Dr. Peterson? Please don't run off, but maybe it'd be a good time to explain how our one and only commercial break will work. Like Lex, here's a brief rundown of our sponsors. First and foremost, I want to thank all of you personally for your support. Just listening and sharing this podcast with your friends gives me a reason to keep striving to provide the best content that I can. If you have the means and you want to contribute personally, it would mean a lot to me. Don't forget about our Patreon page. You can get exclusive access to content and deals just for our dedicated fans. As for the other sponsors here on the show, Awaken Vapes was the first of the Awaken brand, and they have been helping you modulate your highs with CBD-only, high-terpene vape products since 2019. Genesis Farms has been making the highest quality medicinal RSO among many other amazing products, and he started with the medical community back before 2010. Last but not least is, of course, Rose City Labs. They're striving to be the most excellent lab in the industry, serving Oregon and more than the cannabis industry since 2012. Remember, if you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. Also, please leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. I know that every podcast says it, but they say it because it really does help spread the word and visibility. You can also support us on Patreon or connect with us on the social media of your choice. We are at Awakened Exchanges on Instagram and Facebook, and at Awaken Exchanges on Twitter because of the character limit. And stay tuned. Thank you for listening to this inaugural episode of Awakened Exchanges. Welcome back. You might have noticed a little bit of editing, but I'm going to try and keep that to a minimum. You'll notice it more on these scripted episodes because there's just me, and I'm reading a little bit. There's a lot of content that's not just conversational and coming off the top of my head for these. I try to make it a little bit more so. Hopefully there won't be any editing in the interviews at all. But that said, I am a one-man team here at Awakened Exchanges, so thank you for cutting me a little slack. I've always been more of a behind-the-cameras kind of guy, so this is my first time putting something out there with my own voice, let alone my own face, which let's leave it at that. Much like Master Lex has started doing, this is going to be a solo episode. I don't know that I'll do a lot of solo episodes, but maybe some response episodes and such on Patreon. We'll see how it goes. Play it by ear. Check our Patreon page. Communicate with us. Tell me what you like. Maybe I'll do more. It's kind of up to the fans. All right. I suppose you'll probably want to know a little bit more about me and what you're listening to. By the time this is out and on the airwaves, there will be Awakened Exchanges social media accounts where you can see some pictures and maybe even read some detailed accounts and descriptions of the events I'm about to discuss. That's probably more for the extra curious super fans. I don't know how much the average listener is really going to want to go out of their way, but we shall see. I also wanted to make sure that you understand this is not a typical episode. Give us a chance, okay? This is just the intro. I want you to get to know me a little bit better. I want you to have an idea of how I got to be where I am and who I am, where these thoughts are coming from. And before I go any farther, a little reminder, these memories are truth, 100% my truth. That's the problem, though. This is my truth. I sincerely remember this after racking my brain and having some conversations with my friends and family. That means I don't have all of the information about all of the situations. I can only present what I know and how I feel. But it is my truth, and I'm going to be 100% genuine with you guys. It's the only way to be. So I hope you can feel that. I hope you're ready. I hope I'm ready. And here we go. Where should I start? They say you should always start at the beginning. So here goes. The most important people in my early life were my mom, who had me when she was 19 and loved me with all of her heart, my grandfather, who was barely 60, and my grandmother, who was in her early 50s. I was born in a small town in Oregon in 1981 because the even tinier town in Washington that my grandparents lived in didn't have a hospital that my mom trusted. We moved around a lot even before I noticed it after school had started. Most of my early memories are pieced together by which house we were living in at the time, whichever event occurred. My two earliest memories are both around 2 years old, one of which was watching E.T. at the theaters and being so scared for Elliot when he was captured by the government, and the other was when I actually dropped down to the ground to crawl over the lifelong babysitter's split floor, being so scared of that little step. I remember very vividly that one-step division and that how daunting it was as I neared it. Dropping back to a crawl just so I could make it over the barrier, so badly wanting to see those other kids down there. So, it's a bit early to get heavy, but sadly, death makes an appearance fairly early in my story, so here goes. One of my good friends from daycare drowned when I was 4 years old. I didn't really know much about what was going on. One day we were playing, the next I remember a room full of people, and my mom telling me that he wasn't coming back. That's when all the memories get jumbled. There's an adjacent memory of sitting in a church, listening to all the grown-ups talking at his funeral. One day he went swimming at a local watering spot, and that was it. They told me there was a drop-off. It's probably the first time I got scared of swimming, yet not the reason that I'm still not very good at it today. More on that a little bit later, though. For a brief time, my aunt used to watch me during kindergarten. It was so that I could start school with my older cousins in the same school with me. They were basically the closest things I had to siblings at that point, and it lasted until we started moving across the country, basically. Sadly, I soon realized that school was not like hanging out at their apartment. One cousin was old enough that she was in a different part of the school altogether, and the other was just old enough that he had to play it cool. You know what I mean? He was 6 years older than me. I might have been a cool kid at the house, but I wasn't a cool kid at school. I'm glad that I didn't have to know that side of them as much. I went back to my regular daycare here pretty soon, and that was when they were in their second house. It was close enough to the new school, and of course it was the 80s, so we all walked to school together every morning. No matter where my mom and I moved, this was one of the rare occasions that I stayed at the same school for more than a year or so. In fact, from the last 2/3 of kindergarten all the way through 3rd grade, so that's definitely a record. My mom and I have been close most of my life, but when it was just the two of us, she treated me like an intelligent human, not just some little kid. I definitely think that helped me learn and get the wheels spinning at an early age, I guess. I knew my cousins were showing me movies and things that weren't necessarily appropriate for my age. She knew that as well. Since we had an honest relationship with each other, she asked what I wanted to do for my 6th birthday, and I said pizza and movies. She let me rent all of the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Streets that were out at the time. That was 1987 or so. We had already had a talk about real versus fake, so when it came to blood and gore, she didn't object much. You should check out my 2nd or 3rd grade Halloween book. I'll definitely post a scan of that on Instagram. So, anyway, by the end of kindergarten, I was 4.5 feet tall already. No joke, I'm not lying. The growing pains were just about to start, though, literal and figurative. Even on television. Okay, I actually looked this up because I thought this was funny. I wanted to see if it was really true. They were going into their 2nd season, but fuck it, they were still on, right? Every human has rough times, though, and 1st grade was a fairly rough year. My earaches got so bad that I actually lost almost all of my hearing at one point. My mom first noticed it when she dropped a pan in the kitchen, making a loud clatter just a few inches behind me. And yes, clatter, not clouder. But I didn't actually move at all after the pan dropped. I actually got enrolled in sign language at that point, and although all I retain now from that is messy alphabet and a few random words, I ended up getting tubes in my ears to go ahead and fix this situation. But because I had lost that hearing, apparently I had developed a weird Bronx accent as a little 6-year-old boy. So the tubes were another source of fear for my water phobia, as I couldn't get my ears wet for the next few years. I was probably more scared of those earaches than anything. The pain was unbearable. I still remember when one of the tubes fell out on my desk in 5th grade. Crazy. Thought I was going to die for a second, then I realized what it was, and then it was all good. That was a very pivotal year. We'll get more to that later on. It was supposed to fall out of my ears canals, like I just said. Anyway, by 1st grade, I had started speech therapy, and it gave me something to do when I was bored in class. I got my normal voice back somewhere in 1st grade, but it was not the last time I had to do that. By the end of 1st grade, I was 5 feet tall. I'm not kidding, 5 feet tall. My largest growth spurt was about to happen. From the spring of 1st grade through the end of that summer, I grew just over 6 inches. My legs were always on fire. My doctor told me I was going to be 6'4" to 6'7". I thought I was going to be a fucking on the Trailblazers. That was literally the only thing I disliked about this doctor, by the way. He was wrong on that one prediction. 2nd grade seems pretty uneventful in my memory. Or maybe it was just because it was carefree. 3rd grade, however, was a very influential year. Sometime around age 7 or 8, that's when he showed up in my daycare. I will not name him, but he and I shared nearly identical birthdays, month, day, and year. Anyway, I haven't told that many people this to this day, so it's a little weird to do it publicly, but here it goes. Why not tell the world, right? One day, he decided to put my penis in his mouth. It was during nap time, and while I had seen sex scenes in movies, nothing graphic like that. I was the 13th cousin. I had plenty of older cousins, but none of them had talked about anything like that. This was not something I understood or asked for. And he said, okay, now it's your turn. I'm older. I understand this now. He was likely just passing on the abuse that was done to him. As I've looked back on my life, though, that feels like it's at the root of a lot of later poor judgments and misguided decisions. I even remember trying to look down a poor girl's underwear at that same daycare just because I wanted to see if it looked like it did in the movies. I guess we all get messed up in different ways. I hate thinking about the people that I helped mess up during my lifetime. That even applies to when I've hurt people in relationships as I've gotten older. I digress. Let's get back to this. The 3rd grade also involved my first fist fight. It seems like an afterthought now, but a big 4th grade bully was picking on one of my good friends, and I've always made a habit of having a few very close friends, and I've always been protective of those friends. It's who I am, especially since I was always the biggest. Sadly, when he swung, I was deft. I moved out of the way and ducked, and that meant that he actually connected with my friend that was standing behind me that I was trying to protect. Yeah, well, I suppose I tried, but one other notable thing entered my life that year, and it actually was the person that I call my dad. He showed up in my mom's life, and he's been there through thick and thin ever since. So I guess the gross benefit to my life that year ended up positive after all. Definitely a defining early chapter, though. That takes us to the next major change in my life, moving just outside of Atlanta, driving away with what little we could take with us, and leaving most everyone I know behind. We first ended up at a KOA campground for a few weeks, giving me school number 4 to start out the 4th grade. Now, I knew I was in for a rough year in school that year when the teacher insisted that I was from Canada and not from Washington. despite me pointing it out on the map, he then proceeded to say how they were so lucky that I didn't speak French. When I reminded him that that wasn't even the right part of Canada, he just talked right over me. That was the education system. Go 1989. After quickly developing a crush on this girl at the KOA and learning all of the local TV schedule, we immediately moved to an apartment complex in Marietta. I later learned that the reason we could afford to live at that place was because they cashed in all of their savings, and there was an opening. There was a murder in the complex, and everybody was so superstitious that they were afraid of the ghosts. Score one for my parents. Ain't being afraid of no ghosts. And sorry for that awful Ghostbusters reference, but still, the school bus stop for that apartment complex was huge by my standards. It was almost as if the complex filled the entire bus. That said, I made two of my best friends in Georgia at that bus stop. G, another chubby white kid like me, and T, who was a well-dressed, skinny black kid. This would lead to my first experience of racial differences, actually. There was a sixth grader at the complex who didn't take very kindly to me being friends with T. I've never thrown the first punch in a fight, but this fight was mostly a blur. He took a big swing, hit me in the eye. It did give me a black eye. I don't really remember feeling the punch, though. I remember it kind of charging me up, and I hit him once as hard as I could. He fell to the ground. I couldn't control myself at that point. Went a little pre-MMA and hit him 2 or 3 more times. It was 1989 after all. I only knew how to fight from the movies. I backed off. He was crying on the ground. I told him to get up. It's still one of my few fights. And I'm not really proud of it, but I'm glad that I was at least trying to stand up for the right thing. I don't know. I always felt like I was supposed to protect my friends. Security eventually showed up and took both me and the sixth grader away. My mom stood up for me with the complex, pointing out that I may have won the fight, but I wasn't the only party involved. I had the black eye to prove it. That day brought my friends and I a lot closer together, though. For the last part of my time in Georgia, G, T, and I were all so close. We explored this creek that ran through our apartment complex together. We used to make forts back there and talk about all the things kids talk about. There was even the time G and I followed the creek farther than we ever decided to try before and ran across a bobcat. We decided to keep following it back farther, and we were warned about all the danger back here, but we spotted a water moccasin. We all know how poisonous they were. One of the deadliest snakes in America. I had no idea what to do. Fortunately, G picked up a giant rock, threw it at the snake, which had just leaped over at my foot. Fortunately, the rock actually hit the snake in the head and killed it. I have no idea how his aim was that good. It also smashed my big toe. It was hard to get out of the creek and get home that day. A lot of limping was involved. But still, I wasn't killed by a snake, right? So I'm beyond grateful for G. Sadly, after 6 months there, things starting to finally feel normal again, it was time to move back to home base. We were going to move right after my birthday, which was on a Sunday, of course, right after the start of spring break. So with all of my friends, they were already off on vacation with their families. Neither G nor T were there for my birthday, despite my parents' best efforts. We then went and took spring break, driving around across the country. And I got to go back for the last half of 4th grade in a 4th-5th split class back at my old school for school number 6 to start, or to finish, grade number 4. I got back for the last half of 4th grade, a 4th-5th split class, but I was back at my old school, so does that make it school number 5 or school number 6? I definitely ended up feeling like school number 6, but everything had changed in those months. They may have been all the same kids. Some of them tried to be friends again, but not really. One of my best friends had switched to homeschooling. They had nearly a full school year to bond and make new friendships. Add to that the fact that I suddenly had a Georgia accent, and I felt more like an outsider now than ever before. At least everyone in Georgia had a reason to be distant at first. I had a lot of time for books and movies, games, Fantasyland, you know. Art and basketball were also included into my life, but to a lesser degree. Always solo, that was the problem. This was apparently the second time that they tried to talk my mom into skipping me a couple of grades. But she figured I was already having enough trouble in my life with all the changes. We might as well not add that to it. After all, this was not long after finding out that not only did I have half siblings, but I grew up knowing them. And one of them was actually one of my closest childhood friends. And he was 2 years older than me. And not long before school got out for 4th grade, the worst happened. He had been born with a heart condition, and he'd lived much longer than anyone anticipated, but that didn't make it any easier when he died in his sleep. We were supposed to go see him that day, but we didn't make it in time. He didn't quite make it to 12. What was even worse was that one of my other half-brothers was the one who found him. He kind of blamed me for our brother's death, and their father leaving and starting another family. Only one sibling has ever really acknowledged our relationship, to my face anyway. And that was at yet a different funeral, all for one sentence. And this isn't a therapy podcast anyway, so we can move on. I managed to shed the accent after about 6 months or so. And after those last couple of years, 5th grade was a breath of fresh air. I really needed it at that time. Miss Hippie was the first teacher that really nurtured and brought out my creativity. By this point in school, I'd finished literally all of the math and reading activities for the whole school. I finished the 12th grade reading material and was doing 4-digit long division in my head, and mostly bored out of my mind in class. So Miss Hippie had a solution. Our school needed a morning news program. So I was the only kid they trusted with a camera. I got to record it and then wheel it around on a portable TV VCR to each of the classrooms in our school. This was well before every class had their own TV, and I got to stay in each class for the 5 to 10 minute video that we got to present. And then when that was finished, I got to stay and tutor the 2nd graders from my old class. I felt pretty free. Miss Hippie brought in a genuine Hollywood director and cinematographer friend of hers to teach us how to make a class movie later that year. I remember most of the kids working with Miss Hippie because they were working on the acting side, the script side, but I got to work with the cinematographer, Tom. And while it was hard to remember his name, thank you, Miss Hippie, for providing that, I very vividly remember that he was a bit embarrassed to say that he had worked on what he didn't know was one of my favorite fucking movies as a kid, Howard the Duck. All right, I was in heaven. There's no denying it. That class movie was a highlight of my childhood, and it marked the transition from grade school to middle school for me. My 5th grade class was going to be the first grade to actually start 6th grade in middle school. I knew it was going to be a transition either way, but when I ended up in another new city altogether, in a giant middle school built for the entire county, I might as well have been on an entirely different planet. I started off 6th grade in Bellingham, and it started off pretty decently, really, but I was once again the new kid, the tall kid, and the fat nerd all rolled into one. Fortunately, by this point, I was pretty good at finding the right few kids to make friends with. I don't have many that I've stayed close to over the years. In fact, no friend that I've mentioned this far is still in my life. The first that actually stuck around doesn't show up for another year or two, but I always had friends to play with, and we got to travel. You know, I got to travel to Canada for my first time. We got to see Jesse Jackson give a speech at the Peace Arch. I got to take a picture of him myself, give him a handshake with the crowd. It was awesome. My mom was going back to school. She was going to get her bachelor's degree. Things were going good, at least until we heard about my grandma's cancer diagnosis. Not only was the diagnosis devastating in a way that I still don't fully comprehend at 40, or nearly 40 anyway, let alone when I was a 10-year-old kid. My parents were doing well for the first time in their adult lives, and they were about to upend everything, all because the family that was actually physically closer to my grandparents couldn't handle it all the time. The family seems to forget the fact that while we may have told my grandparents that they were helping us out so they wouldn't feel bad about accepting help, my parents were both employed. We had a good apartment. My mom was only a couple quarters away from getting her bachelor's degree, as opposed to the whole other decade it took her to get it after the fact. But despite the personal setbacks, my parents gave up Bellingham and that future in order to move back to that tiny town in Washington, less than 2,000 people, that my mom didn't even want me to be born in. So I ended up with a fairly split school year that year between the two schools. So that marked school number 6 officially, I believe. I'll have to admit that at least having a couple of cousins close by and in the same grade range made me not feel quite like the new kid this time around. The fact that I was basically 6 feet tall by this point, at least by the end of the year, I basically stopped growing, maybe had another half-inch left. It made me a very popular basketball player, if nothing else. That said, I was still the odd kid, and I was about to start growing out instead of up, and that was not very fun. You know how cruel kids can be. But my grandparents and I were always close. My dad's parents and I were close after they showed up in my life as well, but my mom's parents were my weekend getaway whenever we were in the state. My grandfather was pretty much the male role model I had until I was 8. Having my grandma so close was like having another completely loving mother there whenever I needed it. I loved being there with them. My grandfather and I would hang out in his shop and watch baseball, play darts, do random woodworking projects. We'd chop firewood, work in his garden. I'd sing along as he played songs on the keyboard or guitar. My grandma and I, we would cook together. We would talk about our shared love of mysteries. I actually credit her owning the Time Life Mystery series, Mysteries of the Unknown or whatever, as an introduction into all of my esoteric passions. We used to watch the real black and white Nick at Night together, or share episodes of Matlock, Unsolved Mysteries, and Murder, She Wrote, In the Heat of the Night, fucking classics. I learned a lot of love in that household. I was still a kid, so people tried to hide a lot of the truth from me. They didn't want it to affect me. But looking back, I wish I had known more. I didn't understand how sadness can turn into anger, and how people could take little things and explode them into irrational proportions. I don't want to get too detailed here, but there were many stories to tell in this last year. Only one that I'll share. I was told that I was the last one to make my grandma smile. I was in the hospital, and I so wish there was something I could have done to spare her that misery and pain. But I miss that smile of hers so much. Her death was probably the start of the split up of our once very close extended family. Within a week or so of the funeral, we were done with the drama. We packed the truck and drove to Texas. Another new beginning. All right, real quick, I want to insert a little reminder here. I'm not telling these stories to get any sympathy, and this is really just an intro. I'm by no means telling you even a small fraction of the stories I've experienced in my unusual and winding 39-plus years on this planet. We drove across the country 6 times before I was out of high school. Got to see and experience the United States in a way that very few people do these days, if ever. I've seen the sights, traveled to exotic places, had some pretty fucking amazing highs, and some of the most miserable lows you can imagine. I wouldn't wish some of the experiences I've had on anybody. Until the last year of my high school, my mom finally found some career success. After I lived in college, we lived a fairly poor lifestyle. Without food stamps and special programs, there's no way that we would have actually made it through some of those lean times. So I understand how valuable programs like that can be. I know that not everyone in there is trying to take advantage of the system. I didn't know that I was living that weird of a life, or that times were even tough, really. We may have had to get creative, but we always had food on the table, some sort of roof over our head at all times, even if that roof was a truck or a tent for a little while. We'll get into more of those stories as they come up, but this is a rough outline of what shaped my life and my view of the world. I truly hope it helps you understand where I'm coming from. And as I engage in these hopefully mostly awakened exchanges, I hope it helps you understand me in a very genuine way. We were only in Texas for a few months, but I actually liked it a lot there. The highlights include armadillo chasing, picking up my third fucking accent, living in the back of a truck for a while my parents were living in a tent. I got to watch X-Files on a 13-inch black and white television with rabbit ears. I mean, exciting stuff. I got stung by a scorpion. This tiny little guy hit me like 3 times in school, and then when I didn't move, he ran away. Had no clue who he is. Still don't. There was mandatory football practice for every boy in the school, and this was 6th grade. I got to meet Stan Lee, actually. Got his autograph at a convention in San Antonio. I got to see Shaq play against David Robinson in the 93-94 season. His sophomore year, just fucking going at each other. NBA legend centers. What a dream game. Getting to go to Mexico, and last but not least, getting to feed the geese at the Butt Holdsworth Memorial Library. I'm not shitting you with that name, okay? I know that's quite a lot for just a few months, but that's what happened. My grandpa wrote us a letter. It was something he rarely did, and my parents said, the letter told us that it was time to come home, and that was it. We came back home. We moved to Kelso in October of 93, maybe November. My grandfather died in December, just before his 72nd birthday. Fortunately for me, that was also the time that I met Sean. So you'll meet him here soon. You know his work already, or you will by the time the podcast is live anyway, as he's composing all of the original music for our show here. He's been a true friend ever since this time. I lost the accent quickly this time around and consciously chose not to pick up another. I spent most of 2 years there, absorbed in sports cards, comics, and movies. General nerddom ensued, Sean and I, all of our friends, it's just what we did. These years blew by in my mind. Whatever the half-inch or so I had left to grow was done, and I finished growing there, stopping right at 6 foot. My height and general nerdiness made people treat me like I was a lot older. So, in fact, it was actually in Kelso that I stopped getting carded to go to rated R movies. I also started getting lessons on inking comics from a true Marvel and DC pro, Ray Crissing. Yes, the guy from the shout-out in the intro, he was an inspiration to me and still is. Next up was the move to North Carolina. That's the place where I got more comments on my accent than anywhere else, really, and that's because they loved it. I consciously kept my West Coast North non-accented English, or for the most part, and the girls apparently loved it. Unfortunately, that was about the only thing they loved about me. I probably learned to adopt a little bit of a dialect and accent when I was younger, dealing with my hearing problems. I wanted to sound like everyone else, so I fit in. And this time, I wanted to keep my voice, you know? I always knew I was going to come back to Washington at some point, and I wanted to sound like I sounded. This was the last year that I played basketball with any thought of being on a team. Some kid called me Hot Rod in reference to one of the only overweight NBA players ever, and it killed my self-esteem. I wish I knew how to regulate my diet then like I do now, but food has always been a source of comfort and solace for me. No matter where we were at, I could always count on eating my feelings, good or bad, and our first stop in North Carolina was a midway point between Raleigh and Fayetteville. Basketball and comics were my life. I even got my first real job at a comic book store. Got paid in store credit so that I could feed my habit. I was going to every tiny comic convention that I could. I was now hanging out with the artists instead of trying to find new books, though, and I was trying to learn how to be one of them. This is where I met the other guy in that intro shout-out, David Brewer. In my opinion, one of the most underrated pencilers ever to work at Marvel. His era and style, along with Humberto Ramos, Joe Madureira, Stephen Platt, they defined the new wave of comics for me. North Carolina was also home to one of my favorite concerts of all time. And while I neglected to mention it any earlier, a lot of my childhood revolved around music and concerts. My first being Bon Jovi in 1987, actually, standing on the back of a couple of college girls' seats and in the stadium having the time of my 6-year-old life. The concert I'm talking about in North Carolina, however, was one of the all-time greats. The one and only Jerry Lee Lewis. Yes, I know there are multiple issues from that bygone era of his past, but you can't judge history based on current morality. There was a whole lot that was different. There was a whole lot that should have been done differently, but you cannot deny that history was made with his piano. Me being 14 and having free reign with my camera right next to the fucking stage, this family little horse arena, my camera taking pictures, mostly what I remember is that Jerry Lee played for more than 4 hours. He wanted to spite some locals that had cheered for the opening band to come back. So, as you might know, no one goes on after Jerry Lee. He closed the place down that night, and I got to meet him after in his trailer. He so eerily reminded me of my grandfather that I didn't say much besides thank you for the autograph and that I was a huge fan. Other highlights from our first North Carolina stop were winning an art contest judged by the Joe Quesada. Loved it. And I also won an original piece of art that was done right in front of me. It's actually hanging up on this wall that you can't see, drawn by George Perez. Add to that getting to be an extra in the Whoopi Goldberg basketball vehicle, Eddie! Nobody fucking remembers that movie, I'm sure, but I got to run down to the court in between the takes and get as many autographs as I could. It was actually a really good movie, at least as my brain remembers it, but it was a heavenly moment. We stayed in the state next, but we actually, my sophomore year, I got a start in Greenville, and that actually gave me school number 10 for grade number 10. We had some good family memories in Greenville, but we didn't stay there for very long. Our time there mostly revolved around trivia and going to the BW3, exploring the local CD shop. I was definitely a broody teen by this point. But this would probably be the start of my goth phase. I even grew my hair out eventually, like halfway down my back. I'm not kidding you. The most significant And right now, culturally relevant thing that happened to me there was actually this brief race war that happened. A black kid I knew was actually pushed into a redneck's truck. It wasn't his fault. He was actually pushed into the truck. But of course, that offense caused a second redneck to smash a brick into the black kid's face. And this was 1996. There's a train going by right now. So I'm going to go ahead and back this up. This was 1996. I got outraged, as any normal human should have, but it was my basketball friends that actually had to protect me when I took the wrong side of the race war, and I got to learn the term race traitor. I had never heard that term before, but I was about to get pretty familiar with it. I sincerely wish that term never had a reason to exist in the first place. The school was back on an uneasy peace within a couple of days, but it changed how I looked at things permanently. I focused the rest of my year there on finishing driver's ed. And that was about it. In February 97, we headed back to our home base, and I went to school number 11 to finish out grade number 10. This would actually be my final school, though, so that kind of breaks that streak and strands me one shy of 12 for 12, but I was very grateful to get the last 2.5 years at the same school to finish things out. What was really ironic was that it ended up being the same school district that a good chunk of my grade school friends ended up in, so I knew a lot of kids at school already. Guess what? Kids are kids. None of them wanted anything to do with me. They had their cliques, they tightened them over the years, and I was left to be a loner, free-floating between most of the random groups and never really fitting in, yet kind of fitting in, and still managing to be the weird, fat goth kid. Want to hear another bonus? Because I was 6 weeks shy of 16 when we left North Carolina, I didn't officially have my license secured yet. And Washington State decided to make me retake driver's ed. Bonus part 2, I had to wait until summer to do it. Yuck. Anyway, to top it off, I had no real friends. That meant that I was gaming and eating a lot, and that led me to start ballooning. I still managed to find dates on occasion, always somehow out of my league, and almost always instant relationships. Instead of dates like they should have been, I was always involved. Probably because I was afraid I'd never get to another one. But the fact is, the second driver's ed is where I met my high school sweetheart. We dated for over 3 years. I also met the second of my lifelong friends that year. That's Tom. He was a new kid that transferred in from Cali. He turned out to be a lot more popular than me in the end, but we were almost always as close as could be. I coasted through high school just like most of all of school. I'd even took the advanced math path, finishing calculus in high school, not because I liked it, simply because I didn't want to take more math in college. I preferred art. I mean, what can I say? When I talk with Sean, should be here soon, but not the first podcast with a guest. Maybe I'll remember to share the SAT story. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't fallen asleep during the test. As high school neared to close, I was topping the scales at around 275 pounds. It was definitely not all muscle, you know. I was always at least strong and a little athletic, but I was fat. I was 275 pounds. I mean, what can I say? I spent as much time finding every excuse I could to be off the school campus, goofing off with Tom for art projects and such. We just kind of coasted. Anyway, after graduation, my parents took me to Europe. My mom had won a trip for 2 to London for a dinner for the World Trade Organization that her company had bought a table at. Through some creative negotiation, she actually managed to get the return flight to leave from Rome a couple of weeks later instead of from London, giving us time to explore. Well, there were only 2 tickets, my parents had saved and bought me a third ticket so I could go along with them. Having already hit most of the continental 48 and all of the countries in North America, I was about to add 10 more countries and a ton of amazing memories to my list. I'll talk more about these trips as they come up in conversation, but without listing everything, London, Dublin, Stonehenge, Paris, the Louvre, Carcassonne, Amsterdam, Monaco, Rome, Vatican City, many other places, all thoroughly explored as they could be, at least with the time we had. And it was a crucial transition in my life. I transitioned from kid to adult and entered college. It was definitely a very pivotal trip. Next, it was time to follow my mom, my dad, and my Uncle Marvin to Bellingham in order to become a Viking. College was definitely about exploring my options and rekindling a lifelong love of learning. I'd always been into books and teaching myself about things, but this was the first time that I had classes that were not only a little challenging for me, but that I actually had interest in. So I could freely choose my own classes and explore any subject. Nobody was necessarily that far behind me. It was amazing. I started actually as an art major, and then it was photography, journalism, psychology, sports psychology, sociology, and then lucky number 7, technically general studies. But I actually worked with the college to create a hybrid program with the English, theater, and art departments, or the Art College, Fairhaven. My emphasis was technically in screenwriting. I got a lot of training in lots of aspects of writing, from classical to poetry and theater, even screen and technical writing, among other random aspects of film and stage. My Uncle Marvin had passed away way too young because of AIDS in the mid-90s. Education was very important to him. He'd already started a savings account for most of the younger kids in the family, so when he passed, he actually left me a fairly large chunk of money for my tuition. Growing up so poor, I learned to stretch my budget. I always worked at least one job. I took 17 to 20 credits a quarter. I eventually finished my degree in a little over 3 years, and pretty much had a clean financial start. And I even bought a single wide that I could sell later on instead of living in an apartment and accumulating all of those costs. It was an interesting time, especially living like a 5-minute walk from Lake Padden, which is beautiful. Just loved it. Before that, however, I eventually found what turned out to be one of my favorite jobs, maybe ever, because of the crew. I even get to say that I added one more lifelong friend from this job, as well as his amazing partner and eventual wife. It was a good time. I enjoyed my life. I was working at Hollywood Video, getting unlimited free movies, meeting some fascinating people, including one of which that led me to hold a real-life Oscar in my hands at a 4th of July party. I got to watch him light fireworks that were worth more than my car as he tried and succeeded to out-firework Ryan Stiles. We had some great conversations at that store, and they definitely fueled my passion to strive for Hollywood writing magic. You know, that my first film since that school project back in 5th grade was actually a documentary that was brought on by A Day of Infamy. When September 11th, 2001 changed the world, it was a point in my college career where I was still living in that single wide in a 55-plus community, having bought it for a savings account, basically. My classes were based Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I had mornings off, and that morning I was actually preparing to open the store at Hollywood Video. I used to watch CNN in the mornings because I had a poli-sci class I really enjoyed. My first vote was in the Bush v. Gore fiasco. Anyway, I turned my old school projector TV, giant fucking monster thing, right? And I I started to make breakfast. First thing I see is that second plane crashing into the towers. I was already watching a replay of the video at that point when the third plane crashed into the Pentagon. Like most people that turned on the TV that day, it was one of the most surreal days of my life, and definitely one of the most surreal work days of my life. I lived in a liberal college town and as far north as you can get, but right on the Canadian border. Yet instantly, I saw the change in people's attitudes. That following quarter, I had a documentary class. For my final project, I made a 5-minute documentary with a partner, and we chose to do ours on people's attitudes post 9/11. Maybe I'll post it someday. I actually think I still have a copy of it somewhere, not only on the little mini disc, but also on a CDR that had to be split up between two. Anyway, midway through the project, it turned into a look at the irrational growth of Islamophobia in our country. Again, in a liberal town. Art and passion. I'd started to follow those dreams a couple of times in my life, but I've always given them up. Almost always for a woman or a paycheck. Same difference, really, most of the time. Or at least that's what I've told myself. I regret giving them up over the years, but I don't think I'm going to make that mistake again. Even though there's only one person listening to this podcast right now, it's worth it for me to get out there and give people some interesting stories from some real, genuine people, and I hope that you guys are going to enjoy them as well. Anyway, after college, I fell back on technology for the first time, and I took a job with a major antivirus company. I built my first computer at 12, that'd be 1993, for people that need to know the year like I do. I've basically been online since at least 1995. I spent some time hacking and cracking in my teens and 20s, but always white or gray hat stuff. I'd always been bullied in the real world, but online was different back then. Being smart actually gave me an advantage and garnered me a little bit of respect. I loved those chat boards back in the day. This was pre-social media after all. The internet could still be a sanctuary, and the trolling grounds weren't really like they are now. For me, it was definitely a sanctuary, and I thrived there in certain ways, even though it might have stunted me in others. I didn't mind my work with the new antivirus company. I was getting promoted pretty quickly. My coworkers were actually among the best I had, too. I get to count 2 of them among lifelong friends. And if you include their wives, or one wife, that makes 7 people, 5 to 7, including the wives, that's basically the handful of pre-cannabis industry friends that I have left in my life. From birth until age 26, I have a handful, and I think that's good to have a close few people that you know you can count on. When I first got my medical card, that was age 26, that's where I started to meet some more people. I was making a decent paycheck, especially for a bachelor when I was 22 at this antivirus company. Back to that story. Sadly, I was alone a lot of the time during that, and I indulged in everything around me. That includes the free soda that was on the job site. And I was 285 pounds when I started at the antivirus company, so I hadn't hit 3 bills yet. By the end of my 2.5-year run there, though, and all the free soda I could drink, working on my ass, playing video games on my downtime, watching movies and TV, you can guess what happened. I stopped looking at the scale when I hit to 350 pounds. I knew it was time for a change, but I didn't really know how to go about it. When I pissed off the wrong person at work, my favorite VP had already switched to lead another team. I was quickly let go in early 2005. I took that as a sign that it was time to move and try to follow a passion once again. So why not use my degree and try out Hollywood? I moved to a tiny 3-bedroom apartment that I shared with 2 complete strangers in Sherman Oaks, and I found them on roommates.com. How sketchy is that in 2005? It turned out so well, though, I can't even explain it. I even recently got back in touch with the only roommate I had down there that mattered, and we could reminisce for days about the experiences we had. In my year and a half and in the LA area, I had more experiences than I can probably count, but today isn't the day to talk about those. I love the opportunity to chase a dream, and I even found a job at Breakdown Services, getting to interact with real production scripts as well as B, C, and a ton of D-list actors. I was in nerd heaven, especially after a great conversation with the amazing Tim Russ about the screenwriting merits of the first Saw movie. Or Judge Reinhold, when he and his wife were looking into a Bigfoot script they were looking at making. Sadly, the glamour wore off quickly. The majority of my interactions leaned negative. I won't mention their names, but ego, narcissism, and anger were a big turnoff. This is also where I started to get tired of being the fat guy, so I decided to lose some weight. The first 50 pounds came off pretty easily, just with diet and taking about 6 months of time. I started to date someone, and I started looking for a better paycheck, as I always did. And it was for yet another girl that wasn't right for the long term. So what do? You guessed it. Here comes tech to the rescue. I convinced myself that the entertainment industry was toxic. Whether it was or not, it was a total cop-out. I mean, what can I say? By the way, kudos to anyone that laughed in their head at that Kevin Smith reference right there, before I mentioned his name anyway. I fell back on tech, starting with THQ, and testing PC games before realizing the hours would kill me. Who thought gaming would be not a fun place to work? Anyway, my next job would be the last before the biggest change of my life, really. So this was early 2006. I was down to 215 pounds, and that remains about where my max weight gets to these days. Almost 15 years later, though, and I try to stay floating around 200 pounds, where I'm at right about now. I do get heavier in times of depression and stress, though, and who doesn't? I lost the weight the old-fashioned way. I literally dieted and ran my ass off. I first started with a 12-plus minute mile, which almost made me want to puke, and I worked myself up to getting 9 miles an hour, 5 days a week for a while. I still run at that same pace, but I typically run for 4.5 miles, since 30 minutes 3 days a week is plenty to maintain where I'm at this point. You can see the proof on Instagram if you really feel like it, but I also add in some full body workouts with some free weights, body weight exercises, push-ups, pull-ups, squats, things that you can do yourself. I make do with what I have at home. And I have done that most of the time since I've actually originally lost the weight. I definitely know what's possible, but I also know how hard it is to accomplish, let alone to maintain. If you want to see the transformation from kid to fat man through fat man in a thin suit, you can check out the Facebook and Instagram pages. There'll be more pictures on there, I'm sure. Anyway, we, as in the LA Wrong Girl and I, moved back to Oregon in 2006. But while I got to keep my LA salary, I got to work remote. So this was an amazing experience for me, and it's still the best money I've made in my entire life. But you may understand why here soon. July 2008, my then hatred of confrontation still kept me from really wanting to break things off most of the time, but I gave my girlfriend an ultimatum. My dumb ass actually attached a ring to that ultimatum, though, and how fucking stupid was that? Okay, did I really expect her to change her whole self in 4 months? I know that I generally hoped she would, but I knew better. Even as such a naive kid, I don't know. I wish that trait would leave me, but I'm sure it hasn't just yet. Just because you score high on IQ tests or people think you're smart, it doesn't really count for a whole lot sometimes. Anyone can be a naive moron, you know? Ignorance and naivety send at least as many people into the justice system as malevolent intent does. And that was the lesson I was going to learn here very soon. From a little while back, after our first move back to Oregon, I've been investigating medical marijuana. I had a car accident that left me with migraines. I tried all the traditional meds for a couple of years, and I finally had a doctor that asked me if I had tried weed. I'd actually only smoked it a handful of times in high school and college, but I thought, why the fuck not? The migraines could take me out of commission for days at a time. Puff on a joint, getting rid of that in seconds. Yes, please. I know people think that they know what migraines are, but until you have a true one, you don't get it, okay? I still get them on occasions, but what you start is you get these auras. They start to pass in your vision. You can't really see what it is, and you're just trying to look around it, and you realize you can't really read what's going on. Then that's followed by blurred vision, and an inability to read, and light and sound sensitivity began. I've tried to describe it before, and the only description I can give is that of an ice cream headache that, for me, would last from 12 to 72 or more hours without letting up. Imagine that for a second, and tell me if you've really had that happen. All right? That pain becoming a constant companion in your head, even as your thoughts would be too painful. Cannabis was able to change that for me. I've been grateful ever since. We will talk about cannabis a lot on here, with many people emerging from those early medical relationships that I began forming way back then. But for now, let's get back to the main timeline, all right? That's the LA girlfriend and I. She obviously didn't change. That means for the first time in my life, I was single and what passes for thin, at least in clothes, for the first time in my life to end 2008 and start 2009. Even though I've never been able to afford the surgery and I still have extra skin from losing weight and extreme weight loss, despite the fact that I still see the same fat guy in the mirror when I look in there, I apparently developed a semi-decent personality over the years, or at least a passable one. While I think I've always tended to date women that were out of my league for most of my life, all of a sudden I didn't really have to try all that hard. I tended to be a serial monogamist, and I always have, but I wish I'd learned sooner that the potential I see in people does not mean that they're going to try very hard to live up to that potential. That's another lesson I wish I had learned sooner, that, you know, another train. Give it a second. You probably saw the edit, forgive the train, probably still hear it in the background, but we can keep going, you know what I mean? It's another lesson that I wish I'd learned earlier. People have to be ready to be the ones to change themselves. No one else can change a person, only yourself. I suppose this is really where we should begin, and that's where I'm going to share the worst decision that I've ever made in my life, or at least the consequences of that decision. I will address it a little here, but if you have to know more, then you're going to have to go to the Patreon page, at least for now. I'll share what I'm comfortable with there, and a good chunk of it here, but it's not all my story to tell anymore. There's some things that I'm not willing to air everywhere just yet, and this is the worst chapter of my life after all. So if you are a subscriber on the Patreon page, please let people come support us if they want to know more. Don't share it with everybody just yet. Keep the file to yourself. I appreciate it. Okay, so it started with a friend of mine that we'll call A. She was 23 at the time, and I was 28. I I was newly single, having broken up with my ex. She was newly single, having broken up with her high school sweetheart. I'd known her for more than a decade, which was the first awkward thing I probably should have noticed. But we were both adults and friends, and she was looking for fun. We had some fun. We even briefly considered a relationship, but we decided against it. Then she brought over her new 20-year-old friend, whom we'll call B. And A actually wanted to get with B, but not vice versa. So after A decided nothing serious was going to happen between the two of us, I supposedly got her permission or her blessing to date B, but I should have known better. B was young and emotional and used to being treated like shit. I'd never been with someone that was into that hot, cold, on-off thing, you know? I was always confused or depressed, never knew if I actually had a girlfriend or not. It's not an excuse, it was just my mindset, you know? Then, right around Christmas, B and I were in a major fight, of which I won't go into the details here, but the short story version is that I ended up sleeping with A again, among a couple of others, over about a 3-week period there. And the stupidest thing I probably did after all that was tell B what had happened. Because as I've learned multiple times in my life, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. There's a reason that phrase exists, I'm sorry, but deserved or not, that fury is unmatched. And B and I actually tried to get back together, ringing in the new year at my cousin's house, the ones from way back in the story. And I truly thought a new beginning was on the way. I was so fucking right, but not in the way I thought. It was in the absolute worst way imaginable. In early January 2010, a few months before turning 29, my lucky streak ended, and I was arrested when B called the cops on me. So it started because I ate what I thought was a cannabis chocolate. Turns out my friend gave me a mushroom chocolate, and it was stronger than I had had before. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but it was a very painful chapter for me to talk about. Okay? What I will say is, by the end of the year, I wasn't in jail. I was in prison. I took a plea deal on the advice of a public defender, of which there should be more on him in the Patreon episode, but this is what he told me. The deal they were offering me would go away in 24 hours. No male wins a he said, she said case, especially in Oregon, because Oregon doesn't require unanimous juries. One of only 2 states, and now I think Louisiana's already taken that away too, so now I think we're the last state that doesn't have unanimous juries. So the prosecution was going to make an example of me, he said. They were going to run each mandatory minimum sentence, we all know how lovely those are, consecutively instead of concurrently. That means I would lose 25 years of my life if I fought and I lost. This is being told to a 28-year-old kid who knows no better. What that same public defender did not tell me was anything else about why I might have won my case. Hell, he didn't even tell me what an Alford plea was, which came back to haunt me in the end. In fact, within weeks. I wish I had talked to a paid attorney first, but I made my choice. It is what it is. Despite passing multiple polygraphs, including a full disclosure after I was released, things happened. I was scared out of my mind. I was facing a sentence nearly as long as I was old, no hope of good time or reduced time off for good behavior, no perceived incentives of any kind to fight in court for a lesser charge. I took the deal. I knew it was a mistake almost instantly, and I wish I had talked to that paid attorney first, but I hadn't. I had even tried to reverse my plea at sentencing, describing the gross negligence and ineffective assistance of counsel that I learned about between the plea and the sentencing time, just trying to get a trial, but it was denied. I think that's enough detail about this side of things. Suffice to say, I probably owe my parents north of 6 figures between lawyers, support, and visits over the years, and I still had to spend more than 6 years of my life, or 20% of what I had already lived on the outside, on the in. Not to mention the 4 years of probation afterwards that would cost me multiple jobs and severely affect the only real relationship I've had since being out. This decade has fundamentally changed who I am and what I've been called to do with my life. As you can see, it has led me to the Awakened Brands and this podcast itself. Hopefully with some help, the rest of the arc can come together as well. Now, that's the moonshot for me, but I wouldn't have believed the last decade if someone had told me how it was going to play out. So why can't this decade be the same, but in a positive way? If I consciously make my choices, instead of being tempted by illusion with the easy way, there's no reason that I can't succeed. That's enough about this incident for this episode, but I will tell you a little bit about life on the inside. All right? So, I'm what they call a square bear on the inside. Square as in totally clueless, conventional and old-fashioned. That's the sense of the word they meant. Most square bears are house mice or house mouse. He's a house mouse is what they would say. You know what I mean? They have to pay to get some sort of protection, simply because of the pecking order of their crimes. Fortunately, for me, the one thing I had going for me inside was my brain. So that, along with supportive friends and family on the outside, that's what helped me survive and even thrive inside there. I didn't spend much time in county, only a couple of weeks total, but I spent nearly 2 months in intake. That's about twice normal. Intake isn't as bad as solitary per se, but you are in your cell for at least 21 hours a day. Maybe 2 hours of yard time total. I think he got out twice, but I think they were half hours. And all 3 meals, another 20 minutes each. You know what I mean? You can't buy toiletries. You can't buy treats. It's quite the culture shock, to say the least. The yard had no grass and wasn't much bigger than the living room in my current townhouse, okay? I walked a lot of circles on the cement block, just squares, really, not circles, squares. I did a lot of push-ups. I did a lot of pull-ups. I was very grateful to have gotten in shape before I fell, so I didn't have to go through that process as a fat guy inside. It was in here that my reading streak really kicked in. I read in county too, but being a fast reader, I ended up reading through every even semi-worthwhile book they had in that unit library, not to mention the books my parents sent in. I was reading at least a book a day. Intake was actually where I'd even met, Big Mike, who we're going to talk about later on when he really enters the story, but we were just 2 of the noticeable people in the unit. It was a very weird process. But speaking of being noticeable, this was the first place where I had to stand my ground on the inside. About a month in, the cell next door was filled by 2 disrespectful kids, and it takes a lot to get noticed as a disrespectful person in intake. That said, during one of the chow lines, I had to have a talk with them. I learned that lesson quickly. You have to stand up for yourself in there, or you're going to be forever the doormat. So I wasn't going to spend my time that way. They both apologized in the end and backed down. Another lesson I learned quickly, most people are all talk. If that. Anyway, I spent those 2 months hoping that I'd end up somewhere close to my family and somehow avoid the snake pit, or what the storytellers in there called it, gladiator school. The older guys talked about it and genuinely seemed to fear and hate it. I'm sure OSP and EO and all those others are just as bad in their own ways, but Snake scared the hell out of me. I took all of the education tests, which were also scary, but as in a scary fucking joke. I literally missed 0 questions and finished at least 30 minutes before anyone else without having touched math in nearly 10 years at that point. What are we letting our education system go to? Oh, that's a whole other podcast. Their psych test and other evaluations said that I was, surprise, low risk and comparatively normal. After spending a couple more weeks with Elvis's long-lost son, who was getting messages from Reba and T-Swift speaking to him through CMT, well, I was ready to move on. Sadly, you guessed it, they were sending me to Snake River. The one place that was the farthest from my family at the time, and that I was most scared of. The only place I was more scared of than my current living situation. Well, here it goes. Transfer day was probably one of the worst. Just look up front stack handcuff cover and imagine 8+ hours being stacked like that, with one restroom break where you got to eat a crappy lunch meat sandwich with no room to move your hands, let alone wash them if you actually had to use that restroom break. My wrists had indentations for over a week, let alone bruises. Walking the length of Snake River end to end, trying to maintain your composure while being shuffled around through multiple complexes while everyone gives you side-eye was the most nerve-wracking part of the entire day. That entire walk, all I could think of was nothing besides who I would be celled up with, how that first night would turn out, would I have to fight someone, and the honest fucking truth, the big fucking question, if you're a male going into prison, would my ass stay intact? That's not an easy question to wrestle with as a 29-year-old very straight male. That, I might not have been homophobic. I wasn't really banging on that door anytime soon, you know? Fortunately, I didn't have to. What do I find waiting for me when I get to my cell? I find 6 foot 4 inch giant solid beef weighing in at 245 pounds with an MMA and armed robbery background. This was going to be my first real conversation with Big Mike. So, fortunately for me, he at least recognized me from Coffee Creek, and his first words were something along the lines of, thank God. I've had to kick out the last 3 guys because they kept trying to sell me up with perverts. So I'm seriously going to have to fuck up the next freak they put in here. You've got good paperwork, right? That is the dreaded motherfucking question, isn't it? So I closed my eyes for a second. I put my bag down. I stepped back into the space a little bit. And I said, all right, well, we can either fight now or we can sit down and have a talk. He looked at me and he said something like, after what I just said, that's pretty fucking brave. Let's talk. I told him my story. He gave me a chance. And I realized for the first time how powerful genuineness and honesty could be. I apparently earned a little bit of his respect that day, but more importantly, I earned a friend that would watch my back a little bit on the inside. Someone that knew they could trust me absolutely. I gave him some good paperwork that I'd had one of my friends make on the outside, and he told the gangs that he had seen it and that I was cool. I was just square. So I was big enough and I could muster enough confidence in myself that I could stand my ground. I stayed pretty quiet, but I could walk the yard, work out, use the gym, use the day room, no serious issues. I did have to make it clear a few times in that first 6 to 12 months that I didn't want anything to do with politics, especially with the good white dudes who are often the last people you'd want anything to do with. They were definitely the last people I wanted to be around most of the time. They took prison life so seriously that the Joker was a literal idol. I quickly made friends with a number of brothers and natives, and my core beliefs in equality definitely served me well inside. Everyone knew that I was just me at all times, and that bought me credibility and trust in an environment where that was hard to come by, yet all that mattered. So, one of the random things you don't think about is not really having access to any information. People would have to call their families, which costs dollars a minute. It used to be horrendous. It's still not great. But they'd have to call their families to settle little bets on the inside, such as trivia questions and stupid things. Having a brain that remembered stupid facts all the time, well, once I started getting proven right when people would call and check with their parents, that actually got me one of the few nicknames I had inside, Google, as in, hey Google, who was in that one movie with the guy about the vampires where they can't go in the sun or some stupid shit? And I was a glorified IMDb most of the time, but it was nice having a little niche. Since this isn't the prison show, here are some highlights. All right. I lived with multiple murderers, as well as other nasty characters over the 6+ years, all of whom I shared a 7x14 bathroom desk bunk bed combo, all while being confined to that space for a large chunk of my day. I was within feet of a warning shot while I was on a phone call on the yard. I got to see one murder and hear a second, as well as hearing firsthand accounts of all of the people inside and their crimes, because contrary to popular belief, once you're inside, most people love to talk about how guilty they are. Having to navigate multiple gangs, but also finding a few diamonds in the rough. I discovered the Shambhala lineage of Buddhism, trying to expand myself and grow inside. I even tried yoga in prison, aka beware of free ballers. I had to earn privileges and figure out how and who the system chose to reward inside. These are just a few of the experiences that I've had on the inside, and they really barely scratch the surface of the reasons why I hope to give people a second chance with all of the Awakened Brands projects. Most people get sent to minimum when they get down to the 4-year mark. Unfortunately for me, the squeaky wheel does not get grease on the inside of the prisons. It gets smashed and shoved back into a dark corner to fester and rot. So be careful. The more you ask for something, even with good reason, such as my parents' medical conditions and anything else, the less likely you are to actually get it. If people went as far as to get lawyers involved, anything that wasn't court-ordered could become a source of retribution. The guards also like to play little jokes. Like when my friend and I finally had enough good time to have an incentive move so we could move in together and watch movies and talk, be with somebody you actually liked. Well, they finally set us up around 7 p.m. one night. We were having a blast, like I said, watching movies. And then all of a sudden, midnight or so rolls around, bam, 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 knocking on the door. And that's when we were told they were transferring him to minimum the next morning. Literally, we were cellies for less than 12 hours. He had to pack, unpack, and pack again in the same day. And it used both of our incentive moves for the next 6 months, which was his last 6 months, and mine, where I had to deal with who knows who showing up in my cell with no choice. It was not the best of days. Anyway, no matter what the reason that they wouldn't honor my family's request, the physical distance cost my parents tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, and literal and metaphorical mileage on their car and their lives. I can only imagine how much so. So it was a little bit of a relief when I was finally transferred to a prison only 2.5 hours away from my last 6 months. In the end, it was probably beneficial for me to only have been in the dorms for those last 6 months because it's filled with what they call short timers. They also have a tendency to have little man syndrome, and if they weren't all intimidated by my time at Snake, it would have been a whole lot harder to maintain my composure in there. I credit my meditation practice and that Shambhala lineage I was telling you about with helping me stay sane during this time as well. It's weird to say, but the 6 months in the dorm was actually probably a good reminder of how casually disrespectful people are on the outside. The more dangerous the people you're around, the less likely you can be sure that they're not going to just snap and either seriously hurt you or kill you. So respect kind of becomes second nature inside. The guys in minimum were almost all recently outside. They all knew they were getting back out within the next couple of years. It really was like a midway transition between the stresses of the outside world and the inside surreal universe. My parents were there for me on release day, just like they had been there over the years and visiting almost every 2 weeks for more months than I care to remember. But they let me move into their basement in late 2016, and that's where I started to get my first little taste of free life in almost 7 years. Taste is definitely the right word, though, as probation consisted of fees and treatment cost and treatment and real-world responsibilities and many, many restrictions on my freedoms and more obstacles in the job market than I could have ever anticipated. My meditations in prison had made it clear that I wanted two things out of life, okay? I wanted to own my own business so that I could not only just be my own boss, but so that I could support myself and give others that second chance. I also wanted to build that self-sustaining, intentional community that actually had outreach programs to help change people's lives for the better. This definitely wouldn't happen without a job and starting some sort of savings, and so my search began there. 3 months in, I'd gotten a few interviews, but I was always passed over once they got around to the background check. Despite however honest I could be during the actual interviews, they run the check and that's it. I mean, it doesn't matter. You have to find somebody who is really willing to take a chance to give you a second chance. Anyway, I decided to get my medical card and my worker's permit so that my PO would not only let me smoke cannabis again, but somebody would take a chance on me in the industry where convictions mattered a little bit less. Also, if I worked in Oregon, I could get travel permissions to go to Oregon a whole lot easier. It was just little things like that that just made life a little bit more like life. Just before that happened, however, I found the woman that I thought was my soulmate. For her sake, I wish I'd listened closer to her early complaints and saved her all of that heartache and pain. So, this is all I want to say on that topic. I fucked up. It doesn't matter what I may have tried to do to prevent things from getting worse. I was the one who fucked things up in the relationship. I made decisions that shut her down and drove us apart. I made the final decisions that ruined our relationship, even if she was the one that decided to stop fighting for it. Before that, she was my raison d'etre. She was the reason I wanted to do anything and everything. I wanted to do whatever I could to show her how much she meant to me, to keep her in my life. And as I say that, anything to keep her in my life, I can hear how selfish that is. But I love her so damn much. I just wanted her in my life forever. I mean, we've probably all had that feeling at least once. I told her the truth, the full truth, on day one when we met. She accepted me anyway. I thought we could overcome anything and everything, but I realized that she still wanted me to wear a mask and blend in with society. I get it. I want stability too. I really do. That's my main goal here, but not everything can be about money. I found a job finally, and that was 4/20/17. Yes, 4/20. I actually started trimming flower, and I only got the job because I had been proactive and gotten that worker's permit. I turned that job into a lead position, and then briefly even as a stint as their operations manager until something happened that I'm still not quite sure of. I know there's more to it than the story that I have, but I never got a straight answer. No matter the real reason, being let go meant having to live off credit cards and getting into debt that I'm still climbing out of. That was not the first, but just yet another major disappointment to the woman I loved. That was July of 2018, and she'd almost already left me while on a trip to England with her family, which had her questioning us, and now I was once again unemployed and few prospects. But I give her this credit. She stuck with me at that point. She really did. The next chapter of my life actually probably started when I lucked into a job at Rose City Labs. Apparently I gave a decent interview, but now I was making 2/3 of what I was at my last job, and while I could almost pay the bills and mortgage on that pay, how do you pay down debt if you're just barely paying bills and mortgage? So that jolt of unemployment definitely had sparked some creativity in me, and that drive came back. That creative spark would be actually the seed that led to this Awakened Brands that's right here, this podcast that I'm doing right now. I started working on the Weed Lotus logo during that time. Decided what the name would be and trying to figure out what would differentiate us from the rest of the market. After starting at Rose City, getting a little bit of financial breathing room, I decided to make a plan and start 2019 off right. That gave me a couple of months to get it off the ground. I gave it a try, and you know what? It actually went pretty great for a while. I officially launched Awaken Vapes in January 2019. I dove in head first, doing almost everything solo, from design to website, formulating the products, designing the merch, even the displays and packaging and advertising. I wasn't sleeping very much during those days, you know. The first minor successes involved getting shelf space at a major CBD retailer. All right, multiple mall locations where people actually were coming in. I was stoked. That was March, and I started to prepare for our first event, Oregon Hemp Fest, which was coming up in June. I roped my then true love into helping handle the social media side of things. I knew how much she loved being on those kinds of apps, but while she did a much better job than I would have done, she didn't have much passion for the business. I wish now, and I had kept wishing that I hadn't kept pushing her to do those things, but, you know, I digress. Sales were decent in those first few months, and we were pushing towards 5 figures by the time Oregon Hemp Fest rolled around, and I thought we were on a good path, all things considering. I was still working my 9 to 5, but I was getting close to wanting to even give that up and give it a real go. It was almost exactly a year after her trip to England that we went to Oregon Hemp Fest. If 2018 had been a bump in the road, 2019 was probably the start of the roller coaster, and this was the moment. I still wish we had learned to communicate with each other better, and again, I'm the one that fucked that up. I'm taking full responsibility. Nobody to blame but myself. But that beginning of our trip soured her on the entire experience, and possibly on me for good. But I'll probably talk more about the good and bad parts of that literal and metaphorical trip someday. But for now, what's relevant is that the event ended up with me feeling called to be the best version of myself. I'm sure my ex would disagree, and I'm not saying I succeed all of the time. I am by no means perfect, but I am trying to be that best self all the time. I'm now seeing when I failed to live up to my own standards, and my ex's case in point. I'm sure there will be more times that I will, at least in little ways, fail, but I am going to continually strive to be better, try to see those mistakes before I make them, make the choice that avoids that mistake instead. Now's the time for me to get back up, pick myself up, learn whatever lesson I need to learn, and to stop repeating the stupid mistakes that have held me back for most of my life. Because of that, I consider HempFest a success. Not in spite of, but because of the fact that it nearly broke me mentally, and that it was mostly a break-even vendor party with not a whole lot of foot traffic. It taught me so much more about myself than I ever expected to learn, though. That weekend was unique. I just wish I could have shared that experience with the woman I loved instead of having it drive a wedge between us for good. Again, that was my fault. There were almost 3 more good months in 2019, and then I had to step back and reconfigure the game plan. Oregon Country Fair's 50th anniversary was in July. I thought my girlfriend and I had reconnected in a stronger way than ever, but apparently that kind of thinking always turned out to be more one-sided than I really initially thought in our relationship. No matter what, though, we both seemed to have a good time while we were there together. Meeting Patch Adams, who you can see his book up here, was definitely a highlight for me, and I still find him a lasting influence and think of him and what he would do, his decisions, on a number of things when I'm trying to make my own. I still find it so fucking sad with all of these billionaires out there that no one will fund that fantastic hospital that he's been trying to build. $300 million. That's it. $300 million. He's been trying to get it funded and built for over 30 years. What's that? 0.15% of Jeff Bezos' net worth? Probably less at this point. Fucking 0.26. 0.26. 1/4% of Bill Gates' net worth? Oh, wait a minute. Didn't Bill Gates found that billionaire pledge list with Warren Buffett? Do something already. It's fucking $300 million. Fund it. Neither of you would blink at that kind of an expenditure. Anyway, that's enough of that fucking rant, but I have to give credit to my ex. She hit the social media hard after Country Fair, and it almost seemed like she was excited for a little while. We couldn't actually afford a booth at the original Hemp Fest in Seattle, but we went, we passed out stickers, we tried to make our presence known. We were preparing for what I hoped would be the next big springboard for Awaken Vapes. That was going to be the Stay Epic Festival. That was coming up near Medford. It was the last weekend of August, first week of September. It was going to be the big, big event. But instead, if this was a next chapter, the heading would probably have to be the big pause. It was a long drive to Medford, and it was after we had both worked our regular day jobs. I don't think either of us were in a good mood. The light was almost gone when we arrived. We had to set up our tent in the dark as it was starting to rain. All great signs, right? Well, honestly, once things were up and we got a little rest, I thought we both woke up fairly positive. We actually got to have that attitude for all of about 15 minutes when I thought that rough patch might be over. The beginning of Hempfest, though, was much like the beginning of Stay Epic. It soured everything. Sadly, I hadn't mentioned this part yet, but we had a house sitter who also was a coworker of mine that my girlfriend hated. Well, women probably sense trouble. That must just be what it is. And this coworker's need for adrenaline led her to say some things to me at work, and do some things that actually probably ended up collapsing my relationship. But again, I made the choices. They're on me. Anyway, that wasn't for a few more months. The first thing that actually made my girlfriend really hate her, despite, or other than, rather, women's intuition, was that not long after we woke up that next morning, we got a text from her saying that she had accidentally let her cat out. Last night. What was even worse was that we had a video from our front door camera of our cat meowing and waiting to get let back inside at the front door, bathing itself for like a fucking half hour. I blew up. We packed everything up. We drove home. We fought a lot of the way back. All as I saw what looked like Awaken Vapes disintegrating before my eyes. The coworker was gone by the time we got back home, and we found our kitty within a few minutes. So things eventually cooled down, but sales fell as Stay Epic collapsed, and I never had time to expand our retail presence. I had been hoping that events and online sales would provide some momentum, and that I could afford to take that time off and try and expand the retail side of the operations. Instead, unlicensed vape companies started accidentally poisoning people with vitamin E acetate. Oregon instituted a vape ban, and Awaken Vapes was officially on pause by mid-October last year. You get that right, almost exactly a year ago today. So that is a sign that things needed to take that little break. And I needed to reformulate and figure out what I really needed to get done to make this the success that we're making it now together. I thought that I would get to restart in January, but the distance was growing between my girlfriend and I, and since the vapes were on hold, I decided to focus on trying to address the issues and things that were making me less happy in our relationship. Unfortunately, trying to push couples counseling is not a good way to get couples counseling. It was a very unpopular idea, in fact, and it was ultimately unsuccessful. It was made worse by the fact that that coworker started saying those things I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to leave it at that. Again, I fucked up. It's my fault. I get it. I shoulder whatever blame there is. But it didn't make my girlfriend agree to work towards couples counseling. We had what I thought was an amazing anniversary trip over Super Bowl weekend to Las Vegas, right before COVID started ravaging the world. And I thought things were getting better between us, actually. Lockdown began in early March. I had already been reworking the Awaken Brands plan, but having at-risk parents meant that I'd been aware of COVID since before the new year. I'd kept the company on pause. Things went from bad to worse. And then George Floyd's murder kicked off everything. The smoldering fires across our country turned into infernos, and the earlier murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor flamed the fires of this burning anger inside of our country. And the protest began here in Portland on May 28th. We're already more than 100 days into it as I record, and ultimately, my girlfriend's focus on her individual counseling led her to decide to leave me. Literally 1 week before our first couples counseling session. Ouch. I was fairly blindsided and my heart was beyond crushed, but I can't blame her. The only thing that kept me going really was our cat, whom she ultimately took with her as well. But I've got to learn to let go of things instead of just clinging on to them all the time until they're ripped away from me. I suppose we all have to hit the bottom to find the strength to know what's worth fighting for. I fought my heart out for that girl, and it was not meant to be. At least not yet. I can't force her to love me, so what can I do? How about making use of this freedom and this energy to make all of this happen? How about making some dreams come true? Now it's time for me to step into the role that my life has been pulling for me to get into, instead of putting all of this focus into a relationship and trying to make someone else happy. It's time that I learn how much happiness comes from the inside and how I can be able to help share that with other people. How I can help people share some of these amazing stories that I've heard and accumulated over the years. How I can get that intentional community mentality into the universe and really make a difference in people's lives. No matter how many sins have happened in my past, I have served much more than a reasonable amount of time for them. And even by government standards, I have paid my price and I've served my time. I'm even off post-prison supervision now, and I've fought hard to get where I am today. I hope that if you're still listening to this, I can count you among the open minds that are willing to listen and believe that everyone is more than the worst mistake they made in their entire lives. Everyone can change. It's up to you to actually make that change. I'm recording this now and starting interviews this week. Once I get a small backlog of material so that I can figure out this whole process, I'm going to do my best not to let any of you all down. I'm going to start to pick up some momentum with the editing processes, and hopefully this will pick up some momentum. You guys will like what you see, and we can start releasing an episode each week. You're probably sick of hearing my voice by now, so let's please remember this is not a regular episode. You won't have to listen to me ramble as much as this. This is basically me interviewing myself as a guest, you know? I'm trying to tell you who I am, and in the future, you're going to actually get a wide variety of guests and topics, but today, you've gotten to know the real me a little bit. Everything I've said is genuine. I hope you can feel that coming through. That's the intention. These are just a few of the interesting stories that have shaped me as I grew into the person you're going to spend time with on this podcast. I hope this intro has given you a reason to come back next week and to get to know our first guest as well, Sean Beeman, the owner and founder of Genesis Farms. He can regale you with cannabis tales all day long, but that doesn't even begin to encompass who he is. And I hope he lets you into some of his early IT days, or even how Genesis got its name. Or let's get him on the topic of the Grateful Dead. You will really enjoy that. Trust me. All right. Future guests will also include the owner and founder of Archive, the owner and founder of Rose City Labs, one of the main guys behind the Oregon arm of Wana and Stash, and at least one of the founders and head extractors from Beehive, among many more. They all have interesting stories inspiring stories, and I hope to keep bringing you as many of them as you'll have me for. So by the time this is on the air, Awaken Vapes will also be back online. Awaken Bakes edibles are in development, and you're listening to this podcast, so this crazy dream has officially started, and I want to sincerely thank all of you for being a part of it. Everyone deserves to learn from their mistakes and make a better life for their future. Together, I hope that we can make better lives for many more people. The ultimate goal of the Awaken brands is to give that second chance that people might not otherwise get. That chance that I almost didn't get. So with that in mind, our favorite nonprofit is, of course, the ARC. The ARC is ARC, okay? That's the Awakened Research into Consciousness. It's probably our favorite because it's our own, but the ARC is the moonshot of the Awakened brands. It's the self-sustaining intentional community I mentioned. It's going to be built to provide a real way to live in this new economy. It's going to even have a halfway house program to help place and provide support for and resources for inmates transitioning back into society. I hope that'll let me give back in a way that will really make a difference, a positive difference in people's lives. I think that's probably enough for this episode, so please join us next time and see what this show is really going to be about, okay? This is our first regular episode coming up. Before I get out of here, though, before I forget, let's remember that by the time this is live, we're going to be really close to that voting deadline, okay? Elections are always important, especially the local elections, which everybody ignores. So we've got to be better at paying attention. I don't want this to sound like it's just thrown in there, but please, let's remember to get out there and vote. We all need to utilize our rights in this democracy before it's too late. All right, we've had enough. All of us have had enough. We can see the problems in our country, no matter which side of the aisle we're on. 2020 has been a year for hindsight, but let's start to make it right in 2021. Let's make the future bright. A special thanks to all of our listeners. You are the reason that I am doing this. You are the reason this podcast exists, so thank you very much. Please tell your friends about us. Subscribe to us on YouTube. Even if these aren't all video, I'll do my best to get even just the audio ones up there. Subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever else you're listening. Please review us on Apple Podcasts. Give us a 5-star review because I know every podcast says it, but it really does help spread the word. You can also support us on Patreon, connect with us on social media. We are at Awakened Exchanges on Instagram and Facebook, and at Awaken Exchanges on Twitter. So thank you again for those missing 2 characters. I'm out of here. Okay. Thank you all. Have a great, blessed day.